This case takes place in the USA in the year 1974. In the early 70s, hitchhiking was fairly common. You could stick your thumb out on the side of the highway and expect a ride within a few minutes. It was easy, and at times it felt harmless. However, not everyone behind the wheel was friendly, and not everyone who climbed into the passenger seat ever made it to where they were going. Meet Mary Schlais. Mary was born on the 4th of November 1948 and grew up in the city of Champlin. According to public records, Mary was the last addition to a small nuclear family. Her father was called Arnold and her mother was called Louise. By all accounts, Mary had a nurturing and stable upbringing, allowing her creative flair to develop. According to those who knew her, she was one of those children who never put the pens and paintbrushes down. As a teenager, Mary excelled in her studies and stood out for her artistic talent. And in the fall of '66, she enrolled at the University of Minnesota to study art. Mary thrived in the university's creative environment. She also took the opportunity to study abroad, spending time in Europe and immersing herself in new languages and cultures. She loved to travel, and she loved to learn. By her early 20s, she was fluent in German and Danish, and even had begun studying Japanese. She graduated with honours from the University of Minnesota, earning her art degree, and she set her sights on becoming a professional artist. There was never a plan B. Mary began travelling. She simply wandered international cities and rural villages with her trusty sketchbook in hand. She would often travel by hitchhiking, as to stretch her budget further and to meet new people on the road. Mary believed that she was always very careful in her travels. But you cannot be too careful, as sadly, Mary would come to learn in the worst way possible. By February of 1974, Mary was 25 years old and was full of plans. She was preparing for another adventure. This time, it was a trip to Chicago to attend an art show and meet up with some fellow artists. And so, at 10:30 in the morning on the 15th of February 1974, Mary left Minneapolis, intending to hitchhike as she had done many times before. This day was a frigid winter day, but Mary's spirits were high as she set out on the highway. She had her thumbs up and a sign for Madison. The idea was to go to Madison and then hitchhike a ride to Chicago from there. This was a time when there was a national appeal to deter women from hitchhiking. More and more women were succumbing to evil, predatory men, but Mary was a fiercely independent woman, and she believed that she had enough experience. But as fate would have it, she was picked up by an opportunistic man. This man was a little bit older than Mary, and he drove a sporty blue Chevy Vega. What exactly followed only came to light 50 years later, but here is what happened next. This driver was supposedly lonely, and he wanted to become acquainted for reasons which would soon become clear. The two drove off down Route 94, heading eastward towards Chicago. But they wouldn't even get past Springbrook Township, which was 90 miles away from where she was picked up. Mary believed that this man was driving her to Chicago out of the goodness of his own heart, but it wasn't long until he started acting creepy. He began making advancements towards her. Then the man started driving away from the freeway and took a turn to a quiet, isolated area, and this was where he made his first proper move. He leaned in and requested sexual contact, but Mary recoiled and rejected his bids for intimacy. It's at this point that the driver pulled out a knife and threatened Mary. Despite being threatened, Mary was not going to surrender herself and her dignity. At the time, there were national broadcasts aimed at women, which told women that if they were forced into sex, allow it so they could live another day. But instead, Mary tried to leave the vehicle. This driver slammed on his brakes in the snowy tree-sheltered wilderness and ran around the car towards her with a blade in his hand. Mary tried to run through the snow, but this was to no avail. This driver was relentless, and once she was in his clutches, he stabbed her. Mary took the hit, and she tried to stand her ground, fighting off the violent onslaught from the man she placed her trust in. She flailed her hands and her arms, trying to block the slashes and the stabs. But tragically, the attempts to fight off this attacker were futile. Mary was stabbed a total of 15 times in the back, abdomen, and chest. The blade had nicked a major artery, and blood loss led to her losing consciousness. With Mary lying on the floor in a pool of blood and snow, this sick and twisted man attempted to distort her facial features by hitting her with a heavy object. This man bludgeoned Mary between the eyes and above the nose, shattering her bones and caving in her face. According to police reports, the man then placed Mary into the boot of his car and began to drive. He drove down 408th Avenue and then stopped his vehicle. This road was a dead end and acted as the perfect spot to discreetly dispose of a body. This man hoped that he could carry Mary's body from the boot of the car to a ditch where he could bury her. But as he was dragging Mary's body through the frost-covered bushes, a local man was seen in the distance driving his way. The killer stopped what he was doing and ran for his car before making a U-turn and shooting off into the distance, never to be seen again by the folk of Springbrook. Well, not for another 50 years. This local man was named Dennis Anderson, and he was driving in his car with his dog, and he just so happened to be driving round this rural spot. Dennis saw a suspect driving away from the scene in what he thought to be a gold Chevy Vega. He described the perpetrator as a white male who stood around 6 feet tall, with auburn hair and a thick dark mustache. As the man drove off, he left behind what looked like to be a body half protruding out of a ditch at the side of the road. Dennis couldn't believe what he was seeing. In a panic, he drove back to his house and told his wife. But it became clear to Dennis that he had no choice. He had to go and see if this person in the ditch was still alive. Dennis went and got his neighbour and returned to the secluded location where he thought he had seen a body. At around 1:15 in the afternoon, they reached the ditch and saw what they had feared the most, a body with no signs of life. Upon seeing this, the two men ran to the nearest house they could find and called the police. When they returned to the ditch, they were no longer alone. A delivery man had just so happened to stumble upon the scene, and they were deeply disturbed. The police soon arrived after, and what they found was chilling. They discovered that Mary had been stabbed over a dozen times and dumped into the snow like trash. Her purse was missing. There was no identification, just one clue, a black and orange stocking cap resting in the snow. That, and Dennis's earlier glimpse of a compact car and its driver, a detail that would later prove to be inaccurate. So the police had two questions. Who was the perpetrator, and who was the victim? These were the very questions on the mind of many police officers of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Mary thankfully was able to be identified very quickly, but was identified by her brother, something which I imagine must have been beyond horrific. But the first question, this was the question which would not be answered for a long, long time, and not before a huge investigation spanning over 50 years. At the time, Dennis Anderson gave his description of the perpetrator over to the police. A composite drawing was drafted and then published in the news outlets to raise awareness and gain leads. However, some rather unlucky locals found themselves in the crosshairs. Men who just so happened to resemble the composite sketch were pulled in, questioned and scrutinized. Their faces matched, but their stories held up. Each of these men had solid alibis. One by one, these men were released. None of them could be connected to the murder case, and with those leads dead, officers turned their attention to Dennis. After all, he was the one who found the body first, but the officers found it suspicious that he did not check for signs of life first. He had driven away without saying a word, and got someone else to come with him to check on the body. This alone raised suspicion. Worse still was his reasons for being there. He claimed that he had gone to this secluded area because his dog wasn't ready to go home yet. He said he and his dog went for a walk, but his dog wanted to spend more time in the car. This was an incredibly strange excuse to say the least, but maybe it was just a dog owner's instinct. Over the years, Dennis was brought in again and again and again. Officers tried to press him, trip him up, and wear him down, but Dennis never wavered, and his account never changed, and the evidence eventually supported him. Investigators had found one clue, the hat that was found at the crime scene. Inside this hat were a few fine hairs. Not many, but there were enough to examine. In the early 70s, forensic tools were crude. No advanced DNA tests and no genetic databases, just microscopes and guesswork. Technicians compared the hair samples side by side. They checked for colour, structure, and shape. They looked for patterns only visible under glass. The hairs didn't match up with Dennis. The police began looking into other violent criminals who were known to operate in the area, and they had their hairs compared. But none of them matched, and the trail went cold. The momentum behind Mary's case collapsed, and files gathered dust. It was labelled as what no family wants to hear: a cold case, a place where the dead go silent and the living wait in vain. And then the years began to pass, one after another. So too did the investigators at the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. They began to let the case slip into memory. But Mary's family never gave up. In the late 2000s, a flicker of hope returned. The department's cold case unit announced it would revisit Mary's murder. They planned to DNA sequence the hairs found in the orange and black hat, and in 2009 they went a step further. Authorities exhumed Mary's body. They were searching for any remaining DNA, perhaps under her fingernails if she had scratched her attacker in a final act of desperation. Combining what was recovered from her fingernails and the hat, forensic experts managed to develop a partial male DNA profile. This DNA profile was then entered into the CODIS, the National DNA Database. The family held their breath, and the results came back empty. The killer's DNA was not in the system, and from this, years continued to go on by. But then, in 2022, the case shifted again. Dunn County partnered with Ramapo College in New Jersey, specialists in investigative genetic genealogy. The team had developed the tools to dig far beyond the traditional law enforcement databases. By looking into family trees, they hoped to narrow down possible relatives. This took slightly longer than expected due to only having a partial DNA sequence to begin with. But by the end of 2023, they had a potential lineage. Only 2 men in the country matched with what the team had uncovered. They were cousins, one in Wyoming and the other one in Michigan. These 2 suspects were more than happy to give their DNA samples to the police for comparison, as they knew that they had committed no murders. But these leads did not match the DNA profile. Confusion began to grip the team. 2 years of work, and the trail had completely collapsed. But then someone asked the right question. What if this family tree was incomplete? What if someone had been adopted? In 2024, that hunch cracked the case. They discovered a woman in the database related to the 2 previous suspects, but clearly too young and the wrong gender. When questioned, she led them to her biological relative, an 84-year-old man living alone in Minnesota. Pressure was on for the cold case teams, as this was likely their last chance. On the 19th of October 2024, the team identified the killer, John K. Miller. The police arrived at his modest house where he lived alone. When he opened the doors, he knew exactly what the police were there for. He let them in and had a conversation with the police in his own living room. John sat in his wheelchair as he spoke to the police, and he eventually openly confessed to the gruesome murder. He told the police that Mary was hitchhiking and that he requested sexual contact, but she refused him, and because of this refusal, he stabbed her. Details were not divulged at this stage, but the stab wounds were analysed, and the results were that a confrontation must have occurred when she stood up. Defensive wounds painted a picture of a terrible struggle and a fight for life. John admitted to attempting to hide her body in a snowbank, but fled when another car approached. This, of course, was Dennis Anderson. After he fled from the scene, John said that he never thought about his victim ever again, never giving much thought to the life he took and the people's lives he so callously destroyed. According to him, he never committed another crime like this again in his life. He even remarked that he couldn't even believe he did it. So who was John Miller? Well, for decades, John came across as a quiet, unassuming figure, the kind of person that neighbours hardly even noticed. He was born on the 2nd of May 1940 and was adopted as an infant. Public details of his early life are fairly scarce, but what is known is that as John entered adulthood, a darker side of his character began to surface. By the 1960s, as other men of his age were starting families or fighting in Vietnam, John was already entangling himself with the law. In his early 20s, he was caught committing forgery and ended up in prison for these offences. His time behind bars did little to reform him. After his release, John drifted across state lines and escalated his criminal pursuits. He was implicated in at least 3 burglaries during the 1960s, 2 break-ins back home in Austin, Minnesota, and others in Texas, suggesting a pattern of wandering and lawlessness. In 1965, he turned up in Arizona, where he was arrested for an attempted robbery. A few years later, in 1969, John committed a bold armed robbery in California, threatening a convenience store clerk with a loaded gun. This crime landed him in the notorious San Quentin prison. Court records show that John walked out of prison on the 5th of May 1972 after serving his sentence. He got married in 1973 and attempted a fresh start, but then, a year later, he killed Mary, and he managed to continue on his life without being eaten up by the guilt for decades to come. John would later describe himself as being rather cold-blooded. In the late 1970s and 80s, he kept a low profile. He settled in a small city, and for a few years John flew under the radar. That was until he was caught and arrested for the gruesome murder of Mary. When John was charged with murder, the police shifted to a different line of questioning. An investigator questioned him about the 1972 killing of Jody Trulson. Jody was just 16 when she was killed. She was last seen hitchhiking what was then called Lake Calhoun. A friend watched her get into a gold-coloured car. The driver was a man in his 30s with shoulder-length brown hair. This was the 3rd of July, but by the next morning, she was dead. Her body was found near a creek, and she had been beaten in the head multiple times. The blows were fatal. A forensic report stated that she had likely died almost instantly. Her body was then dragged to a spot where she was later discovered. As of right now, John has not been charged with her killing. Not yet. But investigators believe that he could be responsible for a few more killings, as the way in which he killed Mary seems like this wasn't his first time. And after all, he describes himself as being cold-blooded. As far as I can tell, John has proclaimed his innocence for this murder, and has said that his car was a blue Chevy Vega and was not gold. The court proceedings began following his arrest, where he pleaded guilty to save the trouble of a trial, and he stuck to his original confession. John Keith Miller was sentenced to life in prison on Thursday the 27th of March 2025, after pleading no contest to the 1974 murder of 25-year-old Mary. The sentencing took place in the Dunn County Circuit Court and marked the end of a decades-long investigation that was ultimately solved through forensic genetic genealogy. John declined to speak during the sentencing, but he did acknowledge his lack of remorse over the years, and he confirmed, like he had with the police, that he was a cold-blooded man. Thankfully, John Miller will never see freedom again for his crimes, but tragically, this came far too late. At the sentencing, Mary's family members were present in the courtroom. While they chose not to speak during the proceedings, they issued a statement afterwards, expressing gratitude to the Dunn County Sheriff's Office and the team at the college for their work on the case over the past 5 decades. Mary's niece, Nina, was born after her aunt's death. She has since spoken and has shared that the family plans to visit the University of Minnesota, where Mary held many of her art exhibitions. The family have expressed that they can now celebrate Mary's life and focus on the 25 years when she was alive, rather than solely focusing on the circumstances of her death. At least the family have gotten the closure they so desperately needed. The court also ordered John Miller to pay over $2,000 in restitution to Mary's family. The family have stated that their intention is to donate the money to the college team who helped crack the case, acknowledging that without them, this case may never have been solved. Cold cases like these are sadly rarely solved. But thankfully, due to advances in technology, one killer never got to fully evade justice.